here's the puzzle. Your brain evolved for hundreds of thousands of years without ever seeing a comic book, without ever seeing action lines, without ever seeing multiple images stacked on top of each other. And yet, if you look at a drawing of the Flash, you see speed and you see motion, and that should not work. So today we're going to ask a very strange question. How does our ancient visual system understand metaphors that it was never designed to see? So we're going to take a look at what our ancient visual system that was developed centuries, thousands of centuries before pictures started to be painted on cave walls. The system that evolved long before any sort of comic books, any sort of photography, any sort of metaphorical art. Why is this system so good at understanding metaphorical images? Why are we so good at understanding that? Because this should just not work. So, questions to kind of pose before we begin this. Ideas such as, if we didn't evolve to see metaphorical pictures and perceive them, and yet we are doing that very easily, what ancient system is being hijacked? Is metaphorical image perception just object recognition plus some other thing? So does it go beyond what our visual perception actually is? It takes visual perception and adds a little bit of something to it. And I think one of the most interesting ways to kind of put this into a really stark contrast is to ask the question, and you can speculate along with this. When we look at comic book art, such as this, where it's highly metaphorical, where there's motion being depicted, where there are action lines and multiple different types of metaphorical devices being used, we can readily understand that. But would a chimpanzee be able to understand a metaphorical image? Any ideas, any guesses, any hypotheses about whether they would or they would not be able to? Hmm.
I think they might be able to understand some ideas and the ones that like visually like that make sense visually because like with the invisible thing, we can recognize that as being invisible with the dotted lines or seeing some of the things through that's something outlined. But chimpanzees, I imagine they could do simple processing like if it was a cartoonish image of the tiger with claws and swiping, then but I don't think the outmovement a chimpanzee you would be to really grasp the tech.
Okay, so let's just if I could just recap what you were saying. So you would say that a chimpanzee would not understand the dotted line invisibility the way that we understood it, because that's a metaphor that is more complicated, or maybe a different type of metaphor. But something like, not necessarily a metaphor, but motion in a picture, you believe that they probably would be able to understand that, or more, they would be more likely to be able to understand that. That's okay. And you mentioned cartoony. So do you think that they would be able to understand a cartoony depiction of something, or would it need to be more photorealistic
I
for them?
they can understand as long as it's communicated to them what it's supposed to represent. I know the closest relatives to humans are bonobos sanctuary and they have like a sheet this big with hundreds of squares. The cartoonish representations of like a telephone or a banana or something that it can recognize and use to communicate. It strings together sentences and meaning that the keepers can interpret. And so I think that they can recognize more characterized portrayals, but something as complex that has to be decided upon and like torn apart and analysis.
Okay, yeah. So you're absolutely right about them being able to learn to indicate on certain cartoonish images, press the banana if you want a banana, press the door if you want to go out. They are able to learn those. And it's interesting because those kind of examples show that they can probably perceive cartoons and cartoonish versions of things. They can definitely perceive objects, um, but not necessarily higher order metaphors like the invisibility metaphor, or maybe even the giant ghost lion metaphor would be beyond them. But maybe they would be, maybe they wouldn't be able to actually perceive motion as being depicted motion. So seeing that tiger that's jumping as a tiger that's actually in motion rather than a statue of a tiger. Okay. Any other speculations on our friends, the chimpanzee, and what they might be able to do? So if they were unable to perceive higher order metaphors, would anybody here care to speculate maybe why that would be or what that might indicate? What might be necessary to understand those? Yep.
I think it might have to do with our neocortex and the communication aids. Because when we see something, we can communicate that we see it very clearly with our language. Um, and so when we talk to another person about seeing something, and they're like, "Oh, that thing's big. That must mean it's booming, scary, harsh." And then we can agree upon that on other people, and that sort of becomes normalized. Where something big and a little bit like fuzzy around the edges, where it's far away, huge. Uh, but a chit might believe that, but another one might think, "Oh, that means it's close up, huge." Uh, but they wouldn't be able to communicate that or have a read upon ye, which is kind of where the metaphors or sequels.
Yeah. So okay. So you unpacked a lot of, well, there's a lot of stuff to unpack in what you just said. So let me see if I can go through a little bit of it. One thing that you alluded to was the idea that language has a part in this. And there are various different approaches to how language mixes in with our ability to perceive pictorial metaphors and picture metaphors. And some of the ideas are that there is, in our cognitive abilities, there is metaphor understanding. Like we understand metaphors. That's part of our mind. That's part of what we are able to do. And that understanding of metaphor comes out in both picture metaphors and in language metaphors. So, what is giving us the ability to see a picture metaphor is the same thing that gives us the ability to understand a linguistic metaphor. It's just this underlying ability that we have that maybe chimpanzees don't have. On the other hand, it's quite possible that the linguistic descriptions of things and metaphors of and different ways of expressing that basically is added on to visual perception. And then that's what allows us to be able to perceive visual metaphors. And then the last thing that you brought up is a really, really interesting question that has been given a lot of research and a lot of thought. We're not going to be able to touch on it here, but it's the idea of the meaning of a metaphor, whether it is something that is learned or whether it's something that you just understand because you understand the concepts that are involved. So there's a difference between metaphors, like, and I'll do the linguistic ones. There's a difference between metaphors like life is a journey, where somebody tells you, oh, life is a journey. And usually your reaction to that is like, oh, yeah, yep, you're right. Life is a journey. And you understand, it takes time. You go from one place to another place. You go from one goal to another goal. You kind of travel through the years. You understand what it means when people say life is a journey. But then there's other sort of metaphorical utterances where people will say, well, your mind is like an umbrella. And has anybody ever heard that one? Okay, so it's a metaphor. Your mind is not an umbrella, but you can compare it to an umbrella. But that's not one where people are obvious or immediately think to themselves, oh yeah, you're right. Mind is like an umbrella. But when somebody explains it to you and says, hey, your mind is like an umbrella, it works best when it's open. Then all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, I get it now. So there seems to be some things that we just get. And then there seems to be other things that maybe we're taught. And action lines, and as we're going to see today, action lines that indicate motion, those seem to be a category of metaphor that we just understand. You don't really have to learn that. You put that in a picture, somebody looks at it and they think to themselves, oh, I get it. They're moving in that opposite direction. Whereas something like the dotted lines for invisibility, or if there's any Spider-Man comic readers, the wavy lines coming out of his head for his spider sense, those seem to be needed to be taught, because the first time that you see that, you might not understand exactly what it is trying to represent. And that's why we had panels like that one with the invisible girl, where it was like, oh, the invisible girl can do it. And they show her turning invisible. So keep those kinds of ideas in mind, because one of the really interesting questions that we're going to take a look at today is, how does metaphorical information interact with literal information? How are those two combined? Are they combined in the same way? Is it the same underlying type of information that is just, is metaphorical information just a special version of literal information, or is there some fundamental difference between the two? All right, so all of this is in service, again, of understanding that weird and wonderful thing known as the human mind. So today we are going to go out to the outskirts, to the fringes of perception, and try to tackle that last domino to understand fully what perception is, which is metaphorical perception. But before we get there, I'm going to give you an example of metaphorical images and actually metaphorical video. And this one comes from a cartoon called Justice League Unlimited. And I chose this clip for two reasons. The first reason is because it is an excellent example of the importance of story and the importance of fairy tales and imaginary quests and these sort of heroic stories. And I'm not saying it very well, so I'm just going to turn it over to Neil Gaiman. So Neil Gaiman had a quote, one of my favorite quotes ever, something that I try to keep in mind every single time I start tackling something big. And he said, fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us dragons exist, but because they tell us dragons can be beaten. So that's something I try to keep in mind whenever I'm looking at a task and I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I can't do this. I try to think of it, you know what, this is a dragon. Dragons don't exist, but dragons can't be beaten. The other reason that I'm going to show you this clip is because it shows a lot and uses a lot of pictorial metaphors to show motion. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. So without further ado, just a little context before we get into the clip. So that is the Flash kneeling there on the ground, and the large individual in front of him, that is Brainiac and Luthor melded together. So literally two of Superman's biggest foes, Lex Luthor and Brainiac, have been melded together. And in all of that rubble, in behind and around them, there are the unconscious bodies of Superman, of Batman, of Wonder Woman, of the Green Lantern, of Hawkgirl. So Brainiac at this point has taken out all of the heavy hitters, right? All of the super powered ones. And all that's left is the Flash. And this is one of the Flash's crowning moments. So without further ado, I'll just let him take it away.
Are you going to fight me, boy?
All right. So before we leave this, it just kind of occurred to me. One of the reasons I really like this clip as well is that I think it applies a lot to many of the students here at IUSB because in the sort of view of the world, you're not Superman, you're not Wonder Woman, and you're not Green Lantern. And by that, I mean, you didn't graduate from Harvard, you didn't graduate from Stanford, you didn't graduate from Yale. However, you're the Flash, and you might just have exactly the skills that are needed to conquer whatever psychological problem is out there in the world. So without sounding too sappy, let's get to the point at hand here. So in this clip, the Flash was running, and he was running incredibly fast. And not only did they show that with motion, this was a motion picture, but they also used metaphorical devices to show you that the Flash was running incredibly fast. So, for example, we have these trails or action lines following the Flash when he ran. And then we also had things like multiple images being portrayed. So this is not images superimposed upon each other. This is a still from this clip where you can see multiple images of the Flash. All of this is metaphorical. None of this actually happens in the real world. And yet we still are able to understand it. We're not confused. And we understand, oh my gosh, the Flash is running incredibly, incredibly hard or incredibly fast. So in this case, the reason that this is so sort of confusing in terms of how do we do it and so mysterious is because the last definition that we saw of a picture, the better definition from Gibson in 71, is that a picture is a surface so treated that your delimited optic array to a point of observation is made available that contains, and this is the important part, the same kind of information that is found in the ambient optic arrays of an ordinary environment. And that is the idea that these pictures have information and your visual system picks up that information. And just as a callback to Mitch Hedberg's point about Swiss cheese, that is why you can draw Swiss cheese with a pencil and a paper, because you can preserve the invariant information in Swiss cheese that was present in the real world, in that ordinary environment, in that optic array. The big problem for this definition and theory of pictures is our ability to understand metaphoric images. So giant ghost lions never occur in the ambient optic array of an ordinary environment. Nobody in the history of the world has ever seen this in the actual environment, and yet we understand it immediately that these are not real lions, they're metaphorical representations, and then we can also pick up the meaning. We understand that it means that they're powerful, that they are in charge of everything, that they're the kings of their, domain. And that's a lot different than understanding things that don't exist and pictures of those, because most pictures of things that don't exist are simply combinations of things that do exist, things like horses and things like horns. So the real question is, how can we understand our understanding of pictures when they are real objects, but they are metaphorical images rather than fictional objects and literal images? How do we understand that picture on the left? How do we combine information from that real object that is actually reproducing what is in the optic array, combine it with the metaphorical information? And that is what we're going to try to answer or begin to answer with the study we're going to look at today. So we're going to take a look at the analysis of motions in comic book cover art using pictorial metaphors. This is a research project that I did with Alicia Horvath. She actually did this as an undergrad here at IUSB. And by the time we got it published, she had moved on to the School of Professional Studies at Columbia University. So without further ado, today we're going to take a look at metaphors, talk a little bit about them, linguistic and visual, just so that we know exactly what we're discussing. Then we're going to take a look at pictorial devices, literal devices, and metaphorical devices. And then we're going to take a look at the actual research that we did and the theory that was developed. All right. So linguistic metaphors and linguistic literal statements. So when you say something like the grass is green, that's a literal statement. That is something that has no metaphorical information in it. It's talking about something that actually exists. The grass is talking about a characteristic that it actually has, green. So we understand what that means. It means that the grass is actually green. On the other hand, you can have metaphors in language, and you can say something like, he has a heart of stone. And somehow we understand that that means that he is an emotionless person. He is a cold person, probably doesn't have a lot of empathy. And we know that it doesn't mean this, right? We know that that's not what somebody is saying, because if somebody told you he had a heart of stone and you misunderstood it to be literal, then you would say, oh my gosh, he is a medical marvel. How is this person still alive? He has a heart of, oh my goodness, like, how is this possible? No, you understand that it's not this, it's a metaphor. And if somebody tells you life is a journey, you again understand it as the metaphor that it's intended to be. And you don't think to yourself, oh my gosh, life is a journey. I got to pack. I got to find luggage with my passport up to date because I don't know where I'm going to go, but life is a journey. So you understand that metaphors are breaking some rules. You understand that they're not literal. And that understanding is almost immediate and very hidden. So, and just to kind of give you an example of how hidden our understanding of metaphors are, scientists estimate that about 20 to 25% of everything we say is actually metaphorical. So those are known as hidden metaphors. So if I have explained this enough so that it's clear to you, that's a hidden metaphor. If I have given you enough information here so that you now have an insight to metaphors, that's another metaphor. If somebody contributes to today's discussion and I say, hey, that's a brilliant idea, that's another metaphor, because making ideas clear is the metaphor of vision is like understanding. Asking you, do you see what I mean, is the metaphor vision is understanding. You can't actually see meaning. Ideas are never clear. They're not visual. So again, a lot of what we say is even hidden metaphorical information. So clearly we're really good at processing it. How do we do that? Well, before we get to metaphors in pictures, let's talk about the not metaphors in pictures. And we're going to do this in this study today by taking a look at pictures that depict motion. So one of the big mysteries about static images is, how do static images depict things that are in motion? So how is it that when you take a look at this individual that is running, you perceive them as running? While as when you take a look at these individuals here, you perceive them as standing still. So what is it in this picture here that allows you to perceive that individual as running across the track? And then we have pictures that are literal, such as this one, that contain no metaphorical information. And then we have pictures of running, such as this one here, and falling, that contain metaphorical information. So typically when I show this to students, nobody takes a look at this picture and says, oh, look at those cute triplets all playing together. Isn't that adorable? I'm so glad they get along. No, they take a look at this and they say, oh, okay, that's one individual. And she was running, and then she was jumping, and then she fell, and she's having a good time. We understand that it's multiple images used metaphorically, not to depict a real life situation of three individuals, but to depict something that doesn't occur in the actual real world, doesn't occur in the actual real optic array, which is somebody falling down and splitting into three people as they fall. That just doesn't happen. When somebody jumps in the real world, you don't split into four people when you jump. So this is a depiction of something that does not happen in the real world, and yet we are readily able to understand this as a single individual, not a quartet of rock jumpers, but a single individual jumping from one rock to another. So we have metaphorical information, we have literal information. How do we combine those two, that is what we're going to take a look at with this study right here. All right, so what do we do in this study? I'll give you the background. The first step that we needed to do in this study was define exactly what we mean by pictorial metaphors. So this is one of the things that when you do a study, just this is my little PSA for when you do research or when you read a study. One of the things you want to make sure is that you are aware of the definitions that the person is using. Because when you go to metaphorical pictures and start doing research on it, you will see a variety of different definitions that researchers use. And some of them, they're mostly very similar, but they do have some differences to them. And you need to choose the definition in order to do the work. But which definition you choose is basically up to you. And you need to be very clear and very upfront about which definition it is that you're choosing. Because then if people disagree with you, they can ask themselves, do I disagree with their findings or do I disagree with their definition? And those are two very different things. So we chose a definition that was proposed by Kennedy. That's John M. Kennedy back in 1982. And he was talking about literal pictorial devices and metaphorical pictorial devices. And his definition I really like because it's incredibly clean. And it says that literal pictorial devices represent what is actually in the 3D scene, whereas metaphorical devices represent what is not in the 3D scene. So there is a single girl running in the 3D scene. That is a literal pictorial device. If you split her up into multiple images, there are not multiple girls in the scene. So the multiple images is a metaphorical device. Her arm positions as she was running, that literally happens in the real world. That is literally in the 3D scene. So that would be a literal pictorial device. And you can think of the literal pictorial devices as the ones that follow the rules, and metaphorical pictorial devices as the ones that actually break the rules. So in this picture here, this is an example of a picture of a person running that uses literal pictorial devices. So when you are running, your arms and your legs will be in a certain position. And that is what happens in the 3D world when you run. So the position of his arms and his legs, that is a literal pictorial device because it's depicting what happens in the 3D world. You'll notice that he is off the ground plane. That literally happens when you're running. In fact, if anybody here is a fan of the sport of speed walking, where people walk really fast for marathon in marathon races, the definition of running, which you are not allowed to do in speed walking, is having both feet off the ground at the same time. So a speed walker always has one foot touching the ground at all times, whereas if you're running, you have 2 feet off the ground at some point. So those 2 feet that are off the ground, that actually happens in the 3D scene. Depicting that is a literal device that happens when you're running. On the other hand, when you're running and you fall, as I alluded to before, you don't split up into 3 separate people. There's only one individual here. So the fact that we are depicting 3 individuals does not occur in the 3D scene. So that is a metaphorical pictorial device, and that is the metaphor of multiple images. So before we go on to the historical analysis, any ideas about the fact that if metaphorical devices are actually breaking the rules of the 3D world and we evolved in the 3D world, why is it that we don't really get confused when we see these metaphorical devices?
We've been exposed to art our entire history. Just art is a very human thing. And so even when it wasn't as extreme as few people that looked different, there was cave paintings that worked exactly representations of what was going on at the real world. So while we did evolve in a 3D world, we also have never evolved really without art. So, and while our art might not have been advanced enough to depict these metaphors, they maybe primed us to expect perhaps not exactly reality when looking at images.
Okay, so there's an idea in there. Correct me if I'm wrong. So there's an idea in there that. So are you saying that we evolved up to a certain point, and then pictures came, and then after pictures came, we continued. Our minds continued to evolve, and that's why we're so good at perceiving pictures and metaphorical pictures. It's a possibility because we have had at least 50,000 years. That's a lot of time for changes, for that to occur. So is that one of the things you were speculating about?
Yeah, just that you've been fine tuning what we could process based on representations because of how long art has been around. And even though we had had the metaphorical devices, um, we had also had the ability to make connections. And so we can think beyond just we have learned and, uh, so many things we would never have thought we could figure out until we try.
Okay, yeah. So I'll try to recap and rephrase a little bit about that. The first idea, the idea that we are continuing to evolve, is it's true. I mean, evolutionary pressures never go away. We have alleviated a lot of evolutionary pressures that are on us because of the fact that we can invent things to help us survive in nature. So prior to the invention of glasses, nearsightedness was nearly selected out of human evolution. We were almost gone or almost rid of nearsightedness until glasses occurred, and then we were able to survive, and I include myself in that. Given the importance of being able to communicate without through another medium, either written word or through pictures, given the evolutionary advantage that that had, it would not be a surprise at all to find that the individuals who were, for whatever reason, had that mutation, that little bit of a change in their DNA that allowed them to perceive pictures better and maybe metaphorical pictures better, they would have had a greater survival ability than anybody else. So just imagine if you drew a cave painting and it showed a map of your environment, and it showed the hunters where the woolly mammoths were so that they could go out there and they could hunt for food. I can't remember. Were woolly mammoths around when humans were around? If they weren't, it's a metaphor. So anyway, you have a map to where the food sources are. Anybody that can understand that is going to have a huge advantage. They're going to have a huge advantage for survival. Anybody that can't understand that's going to starve. And if you starve, you're not going to have little cave babies. And if you don't have little cave babies, your genes are going to die out. And all of a sudden we're self-selecting, our environment is selecting for people that can perceive pictures. And then the other kind of thing that you mentioned, this is more of I think like a cultural thing, is that once you sort of learn that rules are breakable, then you can kind of understand more and more and more when rules are broken, right? And it's almost kind of like, that the scene in the Matrix. I don't know I don't know if you did your homework and went to go see the Matrix after the attention class, but there's a scene in the Matrix where Morpheus is telling Neo that the Matrix operates under a system of rules, and some of those rules can be bent and other ones can be broken. And as soon as Neo realizes that he can actually break the rules, he can break all the rules, and he is able to just dominate, the Matrix. And it could be the same thing. It could be that first metaphor is difficult to learn. And maybe you learn it as a child. Maybe you're shown something like this in a picture book as a child, and you're like, Daddy, three girls. And your father goes, no, that's one girl. And she's, falling down. It's like, oh, okay, I get that. And then once you understand, oh, the rules can be broken, then when the rules are broken later on in different ways, it doesn't throw you off because you figure there has to be some intent, there has to be some meaning, and then you can start searching, for that meaning. Very, very cool. Any other speculations? Yep.
Yeah, you mentioned the picture book. I've been thinking about this as like a flip book, and my theory is that perhaps we're processing motion frame by frame. So every individual movement is processed as like a still photograph, and then our mind is putting all of those pieces back together. And that's how literally how photography, videography works, right? So then it just makes sense in my mind that the brain is doing the exact same thing. It's tipping each frame of motion and putting it together, which also explains like the metaphors for motion with the lines, like the engine lines. Because if you look at photographs, or like well exposed photographs of motion, uh, it appears as like streaks of light. So those lines are like the streaks of light. You saw that with the guy running. I mean, his foot wasn't perfectly shaped. It looked like it was kind of smudgy and blurred and had lines through it. And that's the same effect that you would get as you flip through a flip book.
Yeah, so that's a great kind of point too. It could be that the metaphors come out of some sort of physical reality that we are accustomed to, and then it just maps onto those physical realities, right? So, the thing that you mentioned about the our visual system basically just taking snapshots of the world, that has to be true because your cones, your rods and cones, your receptors in your retina, they actually have a refresh rate. They just can't fire continuously, and you'll really notice the refresh rate if somebody ever flashes a bright flash of light into your eyes, and you'll see the light as you move around as an after image. That's your retina trying to refresh itself, right? Usually it's imperceptible because we're not blinded by a really, really bright light. But you actually are just seeing a bunch of still images while your retina is refreshing to see the next set of images. So that's a really kind of cool idea that metaphorical researchers have looked into as to whether or not actual physical constraints map onto the metaphors that we use. So maybe we're so good at perceiving multiple images in action lines because actually our experience of the world includes multiple images and action lines. So if this is one that always I wonder about with multiple images, especially because the thing about Dr. Kennedy's definition of metaphors, the reason that I like it because it's so clean is that it differentiates between this is literal and this is metaphorical. Other definitions, they get a little muddier. Not to say that they're not true, but they do get a little bit muddier. And one example of that is, what do you do with multiple images? Because it is really easy to experience multiple images in real time. If you just take your hand and you start waving it in front of your face, you will notice that you have multiple images of your hand, especially at the beginning, at the end of the wave. And that's not happening in the real world. My hand is not splitting in two, and yet I experience that multiple image. So it might be that that is what is being mapped onto these metaphors. All right, so there's definitely some sort of information that we're picking up. And maybe it's just all literal information that we somehow recoded in a new way, right? So like the multiple images is based on the fact that we actually can see multiple images. The action lines are based on the fact that we can actually kind of see streaks maybe when something goes by real fast, at least in maybe a photograph. So maybe this is where it comes from. It's all just literal, but just sort of used in a metaphorical way. But at the heart of itself, it's really just literal information. Or it could be that metaphorical information is somehow fundamentally different. And if it is, then it shouldn't interact with literal information the same way that literal information does. So keep that in mind. because that is one of the things that we are going to take a look at in the study. So what we did in this study is we did a historical analysis. And what that means is that we looked at successful artists that use literal and metaphorical pictorial devices. So we limited our analysis to only successful artists. We only wanted to take a look at famous artists, artists that millions of people admired their work. And we were going to see what combinations they actually use in their pictures. And it was only after we started this that I actually learned that historical analysis, the technical term, is a corpus analysis. So if you ever read about somebody doing a research project and they're doing a corpus analysis, that's basically what they're doing. They're looking at artifacts, selecting a whole bunch, and seeing what those artifacts tell us about human cognition. All right, so the question became, where do we go for pictures? Where do we go for these artifacts? And one of the possibilities was we go to the fine art world, right? And we take a look at images like the birth of Venus. But the thing that kept us out of the art world, kept us from looking at things like the birth of Venus and from looking at things like the Mona Lisa, is that we wanted to do analyses of pictures that depicted motion. We wanted to see how did literal information and metaphorical information combine to depict motion. And one of the things that we found was that when we were looking at fine art, there is barely any motion. People are usually standing still. They're usually in poses, not a lot of motion. If you take a look at later examples of art, there are some that are non-representational. So composition 8 does not actually represent something in the real world. So those were disqualified. There are some schools of art that are specifically to do with representing motion, but we didn't choose these ones because these are actually very difficult to understand. So this one is called Dynamism of a Soccer Player by Umberto Boccioni. And it's very difficult, even when you know it's a soccer player, to see the soccer player, right? So you kind of get the feel of motion, but you don't really perceive the object. You don't really perceive something as moving. And you can tell how difficult these are to understand because I'm going to show you this next photo, and I don't need to warn you about the fact that this next photo has full frontal nudity, because this is the next photo and it's nude descending the staircase number 2. And nobody I've ever shown this to has ever clutched their pearls or covered up their children's eyes or anything, because it's just, I mean, you can kind of see the motion, you can kind of see the descending of the staircase, but I hardly doubt that if I showed this to anybody without the title, they would say, oh, that's a naked lady walking down the stairs. Yeah. So we started looking for corpuses where there's a lot of motion being depicted. And one of the places that was comic book art. So comic book art did intersect with the quote unquote fine art world. Roy Lichtenstein was the one that sort of popularized using comic book art in his paintings. And he is a rather controversial figure because he kind of opened up the world view of comic art as being a legitimate art form on the one hand. So on the one hand, he brought a spotlight to comic book art and kind of legitimized it in the eyes of a lot of art critics in terms of it being a legitimate art form. But on the other hand, he basically took other people's works, like John Romita Sr. in this comic book that he drew in Girls' Romances. He basically just took other people's works and said, all right, I'm just going to do that, and I'm going to call it my own. So he's highly controversial in the fact of, did he actually add anything to this? Did he actually make a contribution to it? Is it fair for him to take somebody else's art and use it and profit off it the way that he did? That's a TED Talk for another time. But importantly, we settled on comic book art because comic book art maybe doesn't make its way into as many museums as other art. But the one thing that it does do, actually two things that it does, is number one, it depicts motion. And number two, it is very popular. So comic books at different times during their history have sold in the millions in terms of their copies. And one of the great things about them is that they depict motion all over the place. So this is an example of the Flash, and the Flash is running on this comic book. And then we have another cover of the Flash, and you can see here the Flash is running. And not only is he running, comic books also love to use metaphorical devices. So this is a great example of action lines and multiple images being used in the same image combined to help you understand that the Flash is just running through and punching everybody. And these were both drawn by a very influential artist. His name was Carmine Infantino. And he actually put out a guide on how to draw the Flash. And in his guide on how to draw the Flash, he basically instructed the use of multiple metaphorical devices. He basically said, hey, when I draw the Flash, I'll draw him running, and then I'll draw action lines, and I'll draw multiple images, and that's how you draw the Flash. So we'll get back to that. Remember that example right there. We'll get back to it, but that is why we landed on comic book art, because it depicts motion and it uses metaphorical devices throughout a large corpus. So we had a nice selection to sample from. All right, so what do we choose? We analyzed 400 comic book covers from the Silver Age of comics. So Silver Age is 1956 to 1970. Why did we choose the Silver Age? Really, we chose it partially because they seem to draw a lot of motion on their comics during that time. The second reason is because we had to choose some era. So a lot of times in research that feels very unsatisfactory, but we could have chosen the Golden Age, we could have chosen the Silver Age, we could have chosen the Bronze Age. If we thought about it too much, we would have had paralysis by analysis. So we just said, hey, let's do the Silver Age. We can come back to the Golden Age or the Bronze Age another time, Modern Age, sure. And then we focused on one motion, and the motion that we chose was running. So this was our initial study. So we said, you know what? There's a lot of different types of motion. We're just going to focus on one. We're going to do running. So this is an example of a cover that is depicting running. So Captain America is running towards you. The Black Panther is running towards you. Namor is running towards you. And this is an example of another cover that depicted running that we analyzed. So here we have Quicksilver running around Spider-Man very quickly, punching him multiple times. So these were the comics that we chose to look at. So 400 comic book covers, and we chose 5 pictorial devices that we were going to analyze these covers for. There was 3 literal devices and 2 metaphorical devices. And the reason we chose these particular pictorial devices is because previous research had been done using those 5 pictorial devices. So the previous research that we based this study on was done by Claudia Carrillo et al. And she basically chose to use 5 pictorial devices, 3 literal, 2 metaphorical. So we chose to do the same thing. And that is a strategy that you should be aware of when you're doing research or when you're thinking about research. One of the best things you can do is base your decisions on what other people did, because it accomplishes 2 things. Number one, it immediately gives our choice of pictorial devices credibility. So if somebody comes up to us and says, well, hey, why did you choose those pictorial devices? You should choose other pictorial devices. Well, we can say, well, wait a second. The Journal of Perception and Dr. Carrillo, they thought they were good enough. So if you got beef, you can take it up with them. The other reason that you do this is because when we use the same pictorial devices that Dr. Carrillo used here, we can directly compare our results with hers. And that gives us a really good through line and sort of understanding and building upon previous research. Whereas if we used completely different devices, we wouldn't be able to compare it with Dr. Carrillo's work. So if we found something completely different than what she found, and we used different metaphors or different devices, it could be because we use different devices. It could be because we actually found something different. Using the same devices allows us to compare our research directly to hers. So what are those devices? Well, here we have some schematics to illustrate what those devices are. We start off with this image here, which has no pictorial devices specifically for running. So it does have pictorial devices because you can see a person there, a schematic image of a person. But importantly, it has none of the pictorial devices that provide information for running. The first device is a literal device, and that is orientation. And this is a literal device because orientation changes actually happen in running. When you run, you lean forward. That is something that happens in the real 3D world, literal device of orientation. The next literal device is posture. Posture is the actual positioning of your arms and your legs. Your arms and your legs are in a certain position if you're running. They're in a very different position if you're running like a ninja, but we didn't test that. We were just, your arms and your legs are in a certain position when you're running. And then also the ground plane. So you are off the ground plane at some point when you're running. So those three were the literal devices. And then we also had metaphorical devices of multiple images and the metaphorical device of action lines. And if you combine all of those into a single image, you get an image that has orientation, leaning forward, posture, arms and legs in a certain position, off the ground plane, multiple images with action lines. That's all five at the same time. And then what we did is, using those criteria, we went through all 400 images. We looked for running being depicted in any place on those images. And then we just coded which devices were used to depict running. So we would take a look at something like this cover of Captain America, and we would say, all right, in that cover of Captain America, for example, he is being depicted with posture. So it is very clear that his arms and legs are in a certain position. He is off the ground plane. Both feet are off the ground plane. We did not code that for orientation because he was not obviously leaning forward. And there are no metaphorical images, no action lines, no multiple images. For this cover of the Avengers, we have Quicksilver, and Quicksilver has orientation, very clear forward lean, has posture, arms are in different positions, off the ground plane, and in this case, he also has action lines. So that would be a 3 literal, 1 metaphoric pictorial device picture. All right, and then the method for each depicted motion, what pictorial devices were used. We had 2 raters, both I and Alicia rated it, and let's see what the results are. So here we have a graph on the x-axis. Those are the pictorial devices that were used. So each L represents a single literal device. Each M represents a single metaphorical device. So all the way to the left, you have a single L. Those are pictures that were coded as using only one literal device. The single M were pictures that were coded as using only one metaphorical device. LL means that 2 literal devices were used, no metaphorical devices. LLL means that 3 literal devices were used, no metaphorical devices. LM means that 1 literal device was used, 1 metaphorical device was used, and so on and so forth, up to triple L double M, which is 3 literal devices, 2 metaphorical devices. And we literally went through all 400 images, found all the instances of running, and then coded them and saw where they were classified on that x-axis. On the y-axis, we have the frequency with which those combinations occurred. So the higher the bar, the more frequent those combinations were being used by these artists. And then finally, the color code there is the combinations that are in dark blue. Those were used by the artists statistically above average. So those were preferred by the artists. The light blue, those were ones that were used at an average level. So those were also preferred by artists. But the ones in white, those were the device combinations that were actively avoided by these artists. And it's important to remember these are professional, popular comic book artists. And they could do whatever they want to do. They can draw however they want to draw, but they need to make it understandable. Because if they don't, they're not going to sell comics and they're not going to keep their jobs. So that was one of the reasons we chose these successful artists, because we knew that they produced comprehensible images that are easy to understand. And that gives us an insight into how humans understand these images. All right, so what did we find? So the first thing that we took a look at, or the first result we're going to take a look at, is how many depictions of running used only one device. So how many depictions only used orientation? Or how many depictions only used posture? Or only used the ground plane? Or only used multiple images? Or only used action lines? And here we have the results. And the results are 0. There wasn't a single depiction of running that only used one pictorial device. And the reason that there wasn't a single depiction of running that only used one pictorial device is that maybe outside of this one, but every other image is really, really a bad image of running. Like, that is not a good image of running. That does not look like running. So these professional artists would not make poor images of running. So there was no instances where just one literal device was used, no instances where just one metaphorical device was used. So now we're going to take a look at depictions of running that only use literal devices. So these are ones that did not use any metaphorical information, only use literal devices. So that would be combinations such as orientation and posture. So 2 literal devices. We have orientation in the ground plane. We have posture in the ground plane. And we have the combination of all 3. So up to all 3 literal devices, no metaphorical information whatsoever. And what we found was that this combination, just using multiple literal devices, that was highly preferred by artists. That was used in a statistically above average amount of times by these artists. So they preferred to draw combinations of just literal information in order to depict their characters as running. All right, next category there. How many depictions of running used only one literal and one metaphorical device? So this is our first combination. So one literal and one metaphorical device might be orientation and action lines. It might be posture and action lines. It might be ground plane and multiple images. And what we found was that absolutely no artist did that. None of the artists of these 400 comic book covers combined a single literal device with a single metaphorical device. All right, so what about multiple literal and one metaphorical device? So we already saw that multiple literal devices are used extensively. Do artists like to add one metaphorical device to those literal depictions? So do they like to use orientation and posture and then add multiple images? Do they like to use posture and ground plane and then add the metaphorical device of action lines? And what we found there was that, yes, they do. That's actually statistically significantly on the average level. So they might not prefer it, but they definitely don't avoid it. They use it at about an average level. So it is extensively used in depictions of running. So the next one there, double M, that is the depictions of running that use only metaphorical devices. So that would be a combination of multiple images and action lines. And if you look at that, not a great depiction of running. And if you look at the graph, none of the artists actually did that. So none of them used 2 metaphorical devices alone. But what about literal devices with multiple metaphorical devices? So we saw that literal devices on their own are used extensively. We saw that literal devices combined with one metaphorical device also used extensively. What about literal devices combined with 2 metaphorical devices? Is that going to be even better? is an image like this that combines orientation, posture, and ground plane with metaphorical action lines and metaphorical multiple images. Is this going to be preferred by artists as some sort of holy grail of how to depict running? Well, what we found was that for the literal devices with multiple metaphorical images, we had one. We had one instance in the entire corpus. So that is statistically below average. And what that means is that these artists actually avoid combining multiple metaphors in an image of running. So this was very surprising. You can see that the Flash is incredibly surprised at that bar. And we're going to talk about why in just a little bit. But first, let's take a look at what this actually means. Because again, remember that this is completely up to the artist. And these artists are trying to communicate effectively. That is basically what their job is. Draw these pictures so that they communicate the ideas that the storyteller is trying to say effectively. And the fact that they avoid multiple metaphors in a single image tells you something about how effective multiple metaphors actually are. All right, so before we get to the conclusions, any questions about those results? All right. So conclusions, literal devices and metaphorical devices. So where are they the same? They're the same in the fact that solo devices are not used. So in these literal devices and metaphorical devices, the devices on their own, no single device had enough information to give you a good depiction of running, right? So the solo devices on their own, they're not used because they just don't reach like a threshold of depiction, a threshold of information that allows you to really perceive the image as running. For literal devices, additional single devices used and additional single devices used for metaphorical devices. What that means is that if you have a picture and you want to make it better, you can add a single literal device. If you have a picture and you want to make it better, you can add a single metaphorical device. Additional single devices are oftentimes used. And the big difference, though, is that for literal devices, multiple devices were used, but for metaphorical devices, multiple devices were not used. And that is the difference right there. So up until that point, up until this point right here, it really looked like literal devices and metaphorical devices were being used the same way in your mind. It literally looked like they were just the same thing. They were both information, and they were the same type of information because they operated in the same sort of rules. You don't just use one because you need more information. You can add to them because you add additional devices and it increases the amount of information. So it really looked like literal and metaphorical devices were basically the same concept, basically the same idea. But once you get to the use of multiple devices, you can see that they're not the same. And there's something fundamentally different about the way your mind deals with metaphorical information versus the way that your mind deals with literal information. So this result here led us to devise the literal devices additive metaphorical one and done theory, also known as the Lamode theory. So I love myself, a little anagram every once in a while. And I like this one because Lamode, I mean, who doesn't like ice cream on their pie? It just makes you feel good. So this was the Lamode theory. And it is the idea that we fundamentally process literal information and metaphorical information differently. Literal devices, they're additive. You have literal devices, you want to make a picture better, you add more. And if you want to make it even better, you can add more and you can add more and you can add more. They stack on top of each other. And that is how our minds process them. We process them as adding to each other. Metaphorical information, that is a one and done. You add one piece of metaphorical information, you make the picture better. You add another piece, you don't make the picture bad. It's not that it's incomprehensible, but it's not any better. The picture quality does not improve. The understanding of the running does not improve. And that's why artists who are trying to, for example, pump out 30 pages of a comic book in a week because they're working on multiple comic books at Marvel or DC. That's why they might avoid using multiple metaphors, because it does not make the picture better. It doesn't make it less comprehensible, but it doesn't improve the quality of the depiction of running. And that is one of the reasons why Carmine Infantino and his depiction of the Flash is kind of such a mystery, because he literally wrote the book on how to depict the Flash. And he literally said, hey, we're going to put in multiple metaphors to depict this, to depict the Flash. So any kind of speculations on what might be happening in this case and why Carmine Infantino actually wanted to use multiple metaphorical images for the Flash? Yep.
Because they want to express something that is extreme. Like if you're not used to seeing multiple metaphorical devices used, then seeing multiple of them used might be an emphasis. Like if you see 3 exclamation points, people like, oh, got on a beats, the speaker's intent is what tense, and multiple metaphorical devices for running use, oh, the speed, it's completely insane.
Okay, so this might have been a way to depict just massively insane amounts of speed. So that would, one of the things that would predict, and we actually haven't taken a look at this yet. One of the things that would predict is that if you took a look at super speed superheroes, they should have more depictions of multiple uses of metaphor than regular speed superheroes. So if you take a look at Captain America, it should be, 2 literal devices and a metaphorical device, but never 2 literal devices and 2 metaphorical devices. But somebody like the Flash, somebody like Quicksilver, who are known for being the super speedsters, they might be depicted with these multiple metaphors because that's just an indication of super speed. Any other speculations on what might be happening here? I wanted to see if anybody else had anything maybe to mention before I came back to it. But you made a really, really kind of interesting um, possibility here, where we just literally got done with kind of telling you the rules of metaphor, right? We basically said, hey, well, here are the rules right now. You can have as many literal devices as you want. You just go ahead and you load up on literal devices. And you can have a single metaphorical device if you want. That actually makes your picture better, makes it more understandable. You can have a single metaphorical image if you want, but you can't have 2. Like 2 is just not in the rules. And it just kind of occurred to me discussing this, that maybe what Carmine Infantino did when he was depicting the Flash, maybe he was intuitively aware of the idea that, well, this kind of single metaphor rule is kind of like maybe an unwritten rule or just something that they did unconsciously. And maybe he recognized that it was another rule. And just like metaphors are breaking literal rules, this might be kind of like an Uber metaphor or like a metaphorical metaphor that broke metaphor rules. And then your mind is able to process it because you already are used to breaking rules. So breaking a rule about breaking rules would be, I guess, just I'm almost losing my train of thought here. It's kind of like there's levels to this game, and he just took it to the next one. That is actually really, really cool. It would be really interesting to think about where else you might get that kind of breaking of the rules. Because to end this lecture, I had one more example, and when we get to language, hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to talk about comedy a bit, because it is one of the great tests of language, because you have to have so much understanding to get a joke. It's literally there in the phrase, like, do you get this joke? Do you understand it? And one of the examples that I wanted to give of stacking metaphors was this clip from Futurama. So this is Brannigan, for anybody that hasn't seen the cartoon. And he's basically a very arrogant but incompetent space captain. So he's going to war and he's coming up with a war plan. And he has this quote that basically links together, I believe, like 4 separate metaphors.
The alien mothership is in orbit here. If we can hit that bullseye, the rest of the dominoes will fall like a house of cards. Checkmate.
All right, so he literally says, if we hit that bullseye, metaphor number 1, the rest of the dominoes, metaphor number 2, should fall like a house of cards, metaphor number 3, checkmate, metaphor number 4, right? That's 4 metaphors. And I used to think that this example was basically an example of why this is never used, right? Because it doesn't really make sense. You just want to say, hey man, if we hit that bullseye, we'll win. Or, we have this attack and everything will, fall like a house of cards. You usually only use the one metaphor. You usually don't stack metaphors on top of each other. But it might just be that what is happening here is the breaking of rules. And if you break a rule, you get a metaphor that leads to understanding. You break the breaking of the rule and you get something different. So in pictorial information, you break the metaphor rule and you get super speed. In linguistics, you break the metaphor rule of stacking metaphors and you get comedy. It could just be that there's like a super level of metaphor that is reached by breaking metaphors. And not to use another metaphor, but I think I'm probably going to explode my mind pretty soon. So does anybody have any final speculations or thoughts about anything? All right. So on that wonderful note, we are going to end right there for today. So next time we are going to move on. I believe we're moving on to mental imagery. So that is it for perception. That is it for picture perception. And that is it for today.